Righto. Um, okay, so our last post-lecture of the term, actually, um, just a little on Emily Dickinson's poetry, walking you through some of the ideas of some of the poems that I've assigned and leaving you to explore the rest, really. Talked a little bit in the introduction about how to read Dickinson's poetry, looking at her poem called Narrow Fellow in the Grass. We talked about the resistance of the editors like Samuel Bowles and Thomas Higginson, who tried to publish her work but tried to standardize her form. And so I just wanted to look at a few of these poems and talk about what they, some of them are famous, some are not, and what they're getting at in different sort of ways, many ways to approach Dickinson. I think one of the ways in which students often, sort of looking for the real person behind these poems. It's what evidence do we have here in these poems that tell us who she really was? And as your editor in Norton pointed out, some of them are perhaps autobiographical in ways, or she drops in a detail from the time of the writing, and maybe some of them are suggested by a news story or something like that. But most of the time, she takes on a persona and experiments with what it would be like to see the world from a certain point of view. And I think that's something that very few poets of her time were doing, experimenting with. Well, maybe Thomas De Quincey or Poe or something like that. Certainly not in this form and this complexity. And what gives these poems their complexity, I think, are these dashes. I don't know, just start at 519. I mean, it could serve, and it does serve in them. I don't know if many of you are familiar with the play made out of Emily Dickinson's poetry. It's called The Belle of Amherst. I've seen it performed a couple of times, and it's interesting how the choices of the playwright sort of decide which of these poems is really sort of getting at Dickinson's, true self or something like that. And I think it's a playful play in the way that the character keeps shifting, and there's no sort of deep theme. You don't get a sort of sense of her being, necrophilic, like Faulkner would have put it in Rose for Emily, or some sort of claustrophobic, or agoraphobic person or anything like that. I think she comes off as being very aware of her particularities and her originality, but somebody who otherwise lives in the world like anyone else does. Look at 519 on page 1684, for example. It seems to be kind of an epigram to all of her poems. This, maybe one of those fascicles that she sewed together, that you could imagine this on top or something like that. Of course it isn't. It's in the middle of everything. It's in 1863 she writes this, I guess. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me the simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see. For love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me. I mean, the first stanza seems to be pretty accessible. It sounds as if she's declaring herself someone who writes poetry that doesn't get read, or who expresses herself, but people don't come to her, or a statement that what gets written in other kinds of publications, traditional publications, don't speak to her, doesn't write, back. But it's to the world. And she's writing the simple news that nature told. And so, I mean, it's kind of an ironic thing that she's calling nature simple in ways that, she makes nature incredibly complex. And even in The Narrow Fellow in the Grass, she takes a snake and explodes what a snake actually is by describing the way one feels when one sees the snake as part of the snake. Describes the sort of movement of the snake, even in the very words. I mean, she's really got a very complex sense of nature. It's certainly not simple. The simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Of course, the words tender and majesty are working against one another. I mean, majesty is usually hard and imperious and large, and just tender isn't the word that you usually associate with it, unless, of course, nature is, very transcendentalist way, seen as deep in a sort of majestic way, even divine. If at the end of nature we find God, and maybe that's what's being suggested in the second half of the poem. Her message, that is nature's message, is committed to hands I cannot see. Perhaps that's sort of God's view. God's hands, the Creator's hands. Her message is committed. In other words, whatever nature means, we're never going to get at. And she's admitting that, and she's open to nature and allowing nature to be whatever it is without controlling it, without nailing it down. Whitman frustrated his reader with an equally sort of open view to nature. It could have all kinds of qualities that are disparate. Famous line from Whitman is, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." And that's here too. But the last two lines are even more baffling, it seems to me. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see. That is, whatever nature means has been handed over to somebody's hands I cannot see. It could be God's hands, whatever. For love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me. Kind of a little bit of a sort of epigram to a bunch of works that she's apologizing for. Dear countrymen, if you do read my work, eventually judge tenderly of me. Even though I can't, I don't have the secret to nature, but judge tenderly of it. But she sees the reader out there somewhere, some sort of reader of a publication, as judging her. But then these blanks around the word sweet. You can't just, ignore the word sweet. Is sweet countryman the phrase here? Is sweet actually being attached to the word countryman? That is, it's like a cajoling of the reader. Oh, sweet countryman, please judge, be judge tenderly of me. Or is for love of her who is sweet, for love of the sweetness of nature, countrymen, judge tenderly of me, because I am tapped into this aspect of nature, even the snake as a kind of fellow in the grass. Anyway, I mean, I'm not going to nail it down for you, but I really want you to read those last two lines. The word sweet can be attached to either side of that one line, and you have to fight it. You have to just sort of think about what is evoked in these lines. Of course, the more classic sort of statement of Emily Dickinson's poetry is found in 466. I dwell in possibility, which is what we were just talking about. It's not nailing down nature, what it is exactly in a scientific way. It's the complete opposite. It's a poetic understanding of nature that dwells in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors. And what are doors and windows but ways in and ways out, ways of seeing in and out. Notice you can be on either side of a door, you can be on either side of a window, and it's so open, right? It's a perfect image for being open to possibility, right? A fairer house than prose, and she's introduced a metaphor. It's an extended metaphor. It's kind of conceit here. She's using the metaphor of a structure, a house, whatever. Of chambers, there's bedrooms or rooms. Of chambers, that is, okay, so what is of continuing there? It's like, again, a syntactical challenge. We're invited to stop because the stanza stops, but then we're also invited to continue because the syntax doesn't. stop. It continues into the next. So in other words, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors, more numerous of chambers, as the cedars, impregnable of eye, and for an everlasting roof, the gambrels of the sky. So we're in this house of whatever it is. I dwell within, but suddenly we're outside. And in the second stanza, suddenly we've left the house with windows and doors, and now we're in nature. And the roof of the building is the sky itself. And so all of a sudden the house equals world, house equals nature, and all of it. And it was just done imperceptibly. And the way she jumped past that break in the stanzas, but continued the syntax. Superior for doors and of visitors the fairest. For occupation, this, the spreading wide my narrow hands to gather paradise. And it's kind of interesting. You imagine her out in her garden, perhaps, if you want to sort of bring it back down to earth and see her in sort of Amherst or something like that. But this is her occupation. Her occupation as a poet is to open and to go from outside the interior. And this is interesting. The woman who never left her house, supposedly, but this is a poem about precisely doing that. But it is an open space that is a mental space, an ideal space, or is it actually your backyard garden? It's fantastic. It is her occupation. I mean, you could dig there too. And I think I want to dig next in and go find a poem. I'll pause for a second, find the poem. The Anne Bradstreet kind of comparison of her seeing herself as a writer. Be right back. All right, a few minutes to go, and just a couple of things. To look at 123, you see, this is a woman who had, read books, and as she's looking out into this autumn scene, beside the autumn poets sing a few prosaic days, a little this side of the snow and that side of the haze, a few incisive mornings, a few ascetic eves, gone Mr. Bryant's goldenrod and Mr. Thompson's sheaves. So she's, quoting poets who have already looked at this time of year in a certain way. Still is the bustle in the brook, sealed are the spicy valves, mesmeric fingers softly touch the eyes of many elves. That's not Thompson, that's not Bryant. This is something Dickinson brings. And she's combining new images here. Perhaps a squirrel may remain, my sentiments to share. Grant me, O Lord, a sunny mind, thy windy will to bear. So obviously it's chilly outside, but her vision makes it sunny. It's a simple poem, but very clever and light. And she looks at herself as a squirrel, not as some sort of majestic animal at all. I asked you about Bradstreet in a comparison. Remember those poems about Bradstreet and her husband, or to her husband on away on employment, traveling for employment. 269, seems to be addressed to a lover. This is Emily Dickinson we're talking about here. Yeah, wild nights. Were I with thee, wild nights should be our luxury. Futile the winds to a heart in port. Done with the compass, done with the chart. Interesting, maritime sort of stuff. Rowing in Eden, the sea, might I but moor tonight in thee. There's passion there. I mean, she wrote another one comparing herself to a volcano. I mean, yeah, I think Emily Dickinson still has that sense of sexuality even in her isolation. Oh gosh, I'm running out of time, and I'm not gonna continue and add. I will say, I'd like to see what you could do with 764. Seems to be a poem addressed to a male model, or is it? Is she the gun who might fire, and he only the person holding it?